Hi, good evening. And tonight you find me sitting here in front of a FoodSense Generation 4. And with this FoodSense Generation 4, I will be doing a live demonstration of measuring a tea sample. But I'll also be playing with the back end. When I say the back end, this FoodSense Generation 4 works in line with a system called Julie. So basically, anytime we make a measurement of caffeine, for example, the data will go up to a system called Julie, and I'm going to talk through this back end and how we can use it to our advantages this evening. So I suppose I should get really on with the slides that I've actually put together. So let me sort of jump into that a little bit faster. So yeah, this is the FoodSense Generation 4. This won't all be talk. I definitely have the meter in front of me. I have some sensors. I have a tea sample, and I'll be doing some demonstrations shortly. But I want to be efficient, and a couple of things I'm going to talk about this evening are extraction, and I'm also going to talk about interferences as well. Talk about how there is quite a lot of literature out there, and when you read the literature, you realize that everyone's doing a slightly different extraction, and that analytical techniques as well, at least historically, have been quite different. So there's a kind of, it's like doing a lot of clinical trials by a lot of different doctors, but nobody ever quite does it the same way. So there's, it's a hard one to sort of do a study on. But that said, we are talking about measuring the caffeine in tea. I will talk about extraction. I will talk about interferences. This slide I'll go through quickly because I've recently done a video on this. But just to say that one of the variables that one can find when looking at tea is actually the moisture content, and depending how far along the process you've come, tea can have apparently different milligrams per gram of caffeine in it just due to the moisture content. A lot of biological systems, human beings, chilies, chili peppers, that is, leaves. When I say leaves, I should say a tea leaf. These kind of things are actually generally about 75 to 80% water. So as you drive the moisture content out of a fresh tea leaf, then the caffeine goes up accordingly. And I do have some separate videos on that, so I'm not going to sort of dwell on that this evening. Something that I've been recently trying to take a look at is when measuring tea, definitely when you're reviewing the literature, people have different extraction techniques. And this can actually, it could have an influence on the amount of caffeine that you actually measure. So first of all, just to kind of, and I noticed that nobody ever mentions extraction efficiency. So in the literature, when you read these papers, it's, at least the papers I've had a look at today, it's very hard to find people any talking about extraction efficiency. But essentially, if we take our tea leaf or tea leaves or our gram of tea, and we put it into our extraction material, we'll extract a certain amount of caffeine. And that total caffeine, let's say, that's in this tea leaf, it's distributed between extractable or available caffeine. These are terms I've kind of, I don't want to say invented. I've borrowed from other parts of the science, let's say, but I've brought them to this particular application, this tea, because I don't think I'm finding literature like this. But there's a sort of total caffeine in our system. And some of it which we can extract, and then some of which I'm going to call kind of unavailable, in terms of it's locked up in so much, it's locked up in the tissue so much that actually you're not extracting it. I think one of the assumptions that people make is that they're actually extracting all of the tea. Now at ZP we actually have quite a lot of experience of, let's say, the chili world, and there the active molecules are often capsaicin, and actually you learn after quite a few years that actually people are not extracting all of the capsaicin, let's say. But bringing that across the tea, you can argue that tea's got a total caffeine content, and people want to measure the caffeine in that tea, so they try to extract it. It doesn't mean that in a particular scientific study, all of that caffeine is necessarily being extracted. So we have total caffeine, which is probably a sum of material that we can extract and material that we cannot extract. I mean, it's perfectly reasonable to think that that is actually, a case. Now, I did some back the envelope calculations because in a bit I'm going to talk about that when you're making a cup of tea, you're nowhere near the solubility of tea. So I do have a sort of slide in a minute, which is, solubility limit of tea. So this is just me doing some back of the envelope calculations just to kind of say that the solubility of caffeine in water at room temperature is about 20 grams per litre, which is 20,000 ppm. You'll see me do a calculation in a minute that says that tea in a tea drink is nowhere near this kind of limit. If we say, if you, let's say, heat the water, I say here at room temperature, and I should have put there 100 degrees C-ish, then we're at 660 grams or per litre, or 660,000 ppm. It's interesting because I was just doing some checks because I was thinking about extraction, and I noticed that actually a lot of papers, they seem to think that organic solvents will help them with the caffeine extraction. Caffeine's quite an unusual molecule. It's actually it's an unusual organic molecule, let's say, that actually it's not as soluble in ethanol, for example, as it is in water. So in ethanol, you can get 15 grams per litre at room temperature, which is about 15,000 ppm. Now, the reason I was just doing those calculations was I'm thinking about extraction, and I'm thinking about people brewing a cup of tea, and I just wanted to kind of say that if we have 80 milligrams per gram of caffeine in a tea leaf, and we are efficiently extracting it, if we put 2 grams of that material into a cup of tea, we're essentially delivering about 160 milligrams in 240 mils. So then I was able to calculate the ppm of that, which is let's say 667 ppm. Now the reason I was doing that was because on the previous page I was saying that the solubility at room temperature of solubility limit of caffeine in water was about 20,000. So I was just doing that as a kind of checking things over a little bit, making sure that we didn't have any kind of solubility problem, but I think we're well away from solubility. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up a little bit is because I've read a couple of papers recently, and in one of the papers they were talking about green tea from Ecuador, and in that they actually say, by the way, we had one hell of a the ranges that come out of these studies are quite enormous. Okay, so there's a lot of ranges of caffeine in tea, but I'm not using that as a discussion here. What I'm actually saying is that they do seem to use in different papers different extraction techniques. Now, your extraction efficiency, you could think of it as the extracted caffeine divided by the total caffeine. So if we've got a certain amount of caffeine in the leaf, some of it's extractable, some of it's not. But that ratio between extracted caffeine and total caffeine, which is very hard, nobody really knows what that is. I don't think, it'd be interesting if there are any papers on that, because I think it's quite hard to actually, if you extract caffeine from tea, you can never make the statement, I've extracted absolutely everything. You can't make that statement, and it's probably statistically not true. There's a point, of course, when you could have argued, I got 99.9% of it, and therefore, it doesn't matter anymore. But I don't think there's many scientific papers where actually they've truly defined that actually they have extracted all of the caffeine. So there's an extraction efficiency, and I think possibly in papers people are making assumptions that actually their extraction efficiency is 100%. They don't use this. I haven't noticed them using this idea, but actually it's not just an idea. I mean, whenever you're going to do an extraction, in chemistry, there is a certain efficiency of that process. You'd hope it was 100%, but unless you've gone away and really measured it, you don't absolutely know that your process is 100%. Now, extraction efficiency is based on some things like solvent property. So, if you extract with organic solvents, that's one thing. If you extract with aqueous, i.e. water, that's another thing. With caffeine, I think it's because of its solubility in water. It's actually unusual that actually water is the best thing to extract with. I mention that because I do see a few papers where actually they start adding organic solvents. But organic solvents do not aid the extraction of caffeine. I would actually slightly argue that they're kind of hampering it. Now, temperature does help you with the extraction of caffeine. So, we saw it on a slide, 2 slides back. There was quite a significant increase in the solubility of caffeine in hot water as opposed to water at room temperature. I had slightly mislabeled the bullet point number 2 and said at room temperature, but when it jumped up, that was actually at a much higher temperature. Now pH, this is an interesting one. Now at ZP, when we're preparing, I say these kind of samples, not that you can really see that, and I may change the camera for a second. When we're preparing these kind of samples, I'm not going to say what the pH of our buffer is, but it's because it's proprietary. But let's put it this way, it's very acidic. And I'm realizing that acidity aids caffeine. Caffeine, it's got what are called a lot of nitrogen atoms in its structure. Those nitrogen atoms can be what's called protonated, and therefore they form quaternium salts or quaterniums, and this aids the solubility. So we actually use quite a strong pH, which probably helps with our extraction. I'm not sure that everyone does use such a pH. And I notice here mixing contact time as well, because I realize that we do quite a fast extraction, let's say 60 seconds. But I do like use a vortexer, and I'm not absolutely certain that people are necessarily using vortexers when they're doing these extractions. I'm just going to vortex this now as well. And I wonder, it's a little bit like we've got quite a simple sample prep. Quite a simple sample prep. So, we just put some 20 volumes of buffer in with essentially 1 mass of the tea, and we vortex for 60 seconds. It's quite a simple sample prep. And we can do it on quite a small scale. And because we can do it on quite a small scale, we can actually use a vortexer. So I'd actually argue that our mixing actually, when we're doing ours, is actually quite quite high. And then we also use quite a high solvent to solid ratio. You can understand that if you're trying to extract something, if you use a lot of solvent to solid ratio, then actually that does help with the efficiency of extraction. Now the reason I bring all this up is because we do have people using this caffeine sensing assay in matrices like tea, and there could be some concern that the sensitivity is higher than otherwise be expected. Now I'm going to address some of those concerns now, but it may actually start off fundamentally from the extraction. Now this extraction that we're promoting, let's say, is something that we've brought in from coffee, and I'm not going to tell people how to do their business, but you could argue, there may be some changes that can happen for the extraction of caffeine from tea. But that said, we use aqueous. Aqueous really does help extraction. We don't use temperature, but we do use an acidic pH. We don't have a long contact time, but we do have a vigorous mixing, and we do use quite a high solvent to solid ratio, and that would actually help with extraction. I just want to talk about interferences. So obviously at ZP, our labs are really, we've got excellent labs. Slight side point here, they're ISO 13485. We really do the contract development, contract manufacturing of medical diagnostics. But in those labs, we do have really excellent facilities, and we can obviously order in chemicals, and we can order in like neat caffeine, which allows us to actually identify the caffeine signal. That will become useful later on when you're talking about detecting caffeine in tea. But we can also see that caffeine signal changing as a function of let's say concentration as well. Now I'm being very deliberate here that if clients share stuff with me, I try to really anonymize it. So this is some client material, but what I want to say here is when I look at their sample, for example here, I definitely see the caffeine peak, and it's interesting, I do see an interferent that's not, it's quite high actually. When I do a sample in a minute, actually I will see an interferent, but the interference not as high as this. I could wax lyrical a little bit about what these molecules are, but I definitely know what this is because it's caffeine, and it's very coincidental with all the work that we're doing. And I'll do a test in a minute, and you'll see the caffeine pop up. But what this you can see that we don't quite see it as strongly, for example, in these samples here. Now, what this interferent is doing is it's lifting the baseline up slightly. So in fact, the the caffeine signal is raised up because of the interferences. But I can sort of show you some ways of removing their interaction. Now you may say, well, why don't you globally apply this? But understand that what ZP has is essentially a caffeine sensor or caffeine assay. There will be lots and lots of different samples to be tested. Sports drinks, coffees, teas, pharmaceutical, I should say gums, and all sorts of interesting things that will all have caffeine in them. So we have to be quite generic, and some of these sample types will actually end up bringing in interferences that we're not otherwise encountered before. With that said, I haven't encountered this, but it's what I really like about this is what's powerful about the FoodSense Generation 4 is actually the transparency of the system, that actually you not only get a number, but you also get the data behind that number, and also the full raw signal. So let's talk about that. So just to say that the way the system works, obviously we have a sensor, we have a FoodSense Generation 4 meter, which I've got in front of me. We put the sample on there. We tell the app what to do through the QR codes. The sample is basically run, and the data goes back to the app, and the app uploads the data to a system called Julie. I'm just going to slightly hide this at the moment. Now, in Julie, we start processing, but do understand that Julie is a very powerful database that actually people can interact with. The problem with it is it's actually so, let's say, feature rich that actually that can be, overwhelming to new users. And it was never really our intention to try to let's say, make the product super complicated. But what will happen in a minute, when I do a demo, you'll see me get a result on my phone. But you'll also see that I can actually do quite a lot of manipulation on this if I think I've got an interferent through the Julie system. So I will show that in a minute. So we do pre-processing, we process, we have information, and we actually send the information back to the phone. And so you can have a nice simple result on your phone. Now I'm going to do a demonstration now, and I'm sorry that I've spoken for something like 17 minutes in order to get to this. But I'm going to do a tea sample, and then I'm actually going to do adjusting the baseline demonstration. So let me just go to here. I will take a sensor, a fresh sensor. I will put it on the FoodSense Generation 4. I will close it. I'm just going to give this a name so I can find it in a minute. I'll call it T59. And I will put 50 microliters of tea sample onto the sensor, which I will do. And then I will hit continue and start measurement. Right, so this is now running the assay essentially live, and when it's complete it will start saying uploading. And when it's finished uploading, it will put my data into the cloud. Now the reason I'm doing this is because if you feel like your data is being interfered with, or there's more sensitivity coming from our calibration than you think is, let's say you may be getting precision, but it may be not giving you the accuracy that you would want. It's good, by the way, to have precision, because you can always deal with accuracy by slightly adjusting calibration, but if you don't have precision, then you sort of don't have the basis on which to do an actual assay. So whilst that is uploading, I'm just going to go to something called Julie. So I was trying to explain it just in the previous slide. In fact, it's just finished running now. So I'm just going to share my screen again with you. In fact, I'm sharing the wrong one. But first of all, I'm just going to hold my phone up to this. Then I'll come onto the big... let's say here, I'll just slightly tilt that so you can see it. I think it's come back with about 121 milligrams per gram. I'm just kind of waving that around a little bit. Now the reason I like that is because that's quite a simple, easy to use assay. But there is also, for those who are scientifically and technically minded, you can actually dig in deeper again on this. So if I can summarize to this point, we put the sample on there, we ran the assay got ran, the data actually went to the cloud, got processed, and came back at 121 milligrams per gram. Now what I want to do is actually talk about the back end. Now I call that sample T59. So I'll just do a quick refresh here. What I really like about this is that so many, let's say, scientific, technical stuff, actually, people hide this stuff because, in fact, it's it's easier to support clients if you don't necessarily show all the back end. But I think the back end for us is really quite powerful. I'm really quite pleased with this actually, because when I look at that, I was being quite sort of pedantic and saying, that is our nicotine. That is our caffeine peak, really strong. And what I found interesting about the, let's say, client data, which I've highly anonymized and sort of, is actually they have quite a interesting. Now they could they could promote that as actually as being probably quite high in what I would call antioxidants, but don't ask me to speculate as to what they are. By the way, you could work out what they are by first of all starting off by looking at the literature, finding out what the common compounds are, ordering in the common compounds, and actually testing them on the device. But anyway, I got a suspicion that many of the kind of antioxidants are that peak. But there's my sort of signal, and there's my peak here. Now I can see that I've been raised off the baseline by this. So if you've got a wishing, I'm just going to turn myself off so I can sort of share this a bit more. You can do this as well. So you can come in here, you can go tools. Now don't forget this is on video, so you can actually sort of slow up what I'm actually doing. I go to properties. Now I'm going to come in and actually have a look at my data, which I will do, and I'm going to first of all, I think the baseline. So it's a very powerful piece of I don't want to call it software. It's a data management system called Julie, which is deliberately set up for electrochemical data. But we got lots of baseline opportunities here, and I just want to put something called an offset in here, and I just want to put in. Let me just do this, and I'll show you what it does. I'm going to put in between 1,000 and 1,600 millivolts. I'm going to do an offset. So I'm basically going to correct the baseline in a slightly different way. So I will do that now, and now that's actually doing the changes. It's very subtle, but what it's in fact done is, it's come to 1,000, and it's actually said between 1,000 and 1,600. Find the lowest point there and make that 0. So what that's done is, now rather than this peak being held higher, I've actually brought the base. This is now the baseline. So before, the peak was actually up at about 40 odd micrograms, but now it's been dropped a bit because I've actually made the baseline here. So rather than being raised by the interferences, I've essentially sort of subtracted the interferences out of it, which makes more sense now, because in fact now I'm measuring the peak height from here to here as opposed from here to here, and that was so if suddenly all my 122 milligrams per gram result, or 121 milligrams per result, it's actually come down to 81. Now I can understand that there could be a couple of reasons for it. A, maybe our algorithm is too sensitive, or B, our extraction is too efficient. But I can understand people's, there's a body of literature there. People want to be lined up with a body of literature. So I just want to kind of show you a simple enough trick. And it's not a trick. This is literally, we are fitting it to a formula. Now this formula is something that we have factory set, but you do have the ability. So for example, if I put in 9.21 here and close that, it will then update the data accordingly. And the data didn't change here, it's just the interpretation of it. And actually now I have 55 milligrams per gram. So what I've done there is, I've done something that I can generally justify, which is I can definitely, it's fair enough to say, right, this is my caffeine peak. If I think that I'm being exaggerated by an interferent, then essentially I've baselined here, so that my interferent now is not lifting the peak up as much as it was. And in fact, I've dropped it, by about 25% because of that. And then the next bit I did was actually said, okay, this algorithm is too sensitive. We're overinflating the amount of caffeine in the sample. And so I went from, in the particular calibration parameter, I went from essentially 6.21, which is the original one, to 9.21. So if I leave at the original, I get 81 mgs, but I'll make it 9.21. Now understand that this is almost like a local change. The reason ZP wouldn't necessarily make a global change on this is because we've got to think about the impact across, many. There's more than impact than just, these particular tea samples. There's a wider impact. But I'm just showing you how you can actually modify in the background a little bit. And then the other thing that I did obviously is I went from what was called I think it was a quadratic baseline. No, it was an iterative polynomial, sorry. And I went to just an offset, a simple enough offset, close that. And I don't really, but if I save this now, it will save all my changes. And that's the beauty of essentially having this back end to it. So at ZP, we do not try to turn everyone into electrochemists, but we do say, this is a technical product. It is going out there and it is going to come across all sorts of samples. People will have different interferences, different blends, things will be going on that you wouldn't, corner cases that one wouldn't necessarily have thought of. And I want to just say, there's almost like two levels to this product. Simple enough level is get the result on your phone, but if you are so minded, you can actually get into some of the baseline corrections, which I just did, and even a modification to the algorithm. Whether that modification is justified, I have to gather more data, let's say, or get more insight. But you can make a local change, i.e. you can change your data. ZP, for example, could roll such things out globally, but then you really got to think about the impact across many scenarios. So let me make sure that I finish what I said I was going to say, which is just do this now. Right, so I just wanted to do a quick demonstration where I did do a tea sample. You saw how quick and easy it was to do. You saw that I was able to deal with that interferent by just doing a baseline adjustment. And if you feel like the algorithm is giving you more, let's say, caffeine than you really think is there, you can actually essentially turn down the sensitivity. I know it's a bit counterintuitive that number went from 6 to 9. You can see that we're using, I think, effectively the reciprocal of it in the actual algorithm. So I have talked about extraction this evening. I have talked about, it's very hard to compare lots of literature because actually they're all using different extractions as well as different analytical techniques. But that said, I have thought about this a little bit, if I can put it that way. And I did notice in particular, one of our clients has got a really quite a big interference that may be lifting their signal up. The beautiful thing is they were able to actually access the data. I'm just literally giving you a tiny little thumbnail there just so you can kind of see it, and just saying, if you do have that problem, then you can just do that baseline adjustment that I did and it will just drop, in their case, probably drop the signal down by about 25%, and they can actually turn down the sensitivity as well in that algorithm by going like 6 to 9. They've just got to make a very careful note for themselves that that's what they've done and probably be consistent in that usage. There's one thing I can say when you look at it. They've definitely got caffeine in there, and you can see how consistent their caffeine data is with our caffeine data, which I just essentially gathered live. So we're all seeing the same thing, if I can put it that way. Okay, so if you have any questions of FoodSense Generation 4 and the measurement of caffeine in tea, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. I quite like a cup of tea. I think I'm becoming very rapidly a little bit of an expert now in caffeine in tea, but any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Okay, thanks very much.